which really came out of my thinking about open source. And I gave a talk, actually my very first talk on open source in 1997 was at a conference in Germany, and I gave a talk which I later wrote down in a paper called Hardware, Software, and Infoware. And it was about the web as an application platform. And and it really started with the idea that there'd been this industry transformation with the IBM personal computer that had to do with the commoditization of hardware. And I kind of developed this talk over the next 4 or 5 years. It eventually became a talk called The Open Source Paradigm Shift, in which I was really talking about the move to the cloud. And at that point, people weren't talking about cloud computing, but I was thinking about this idea that the internet was becoming the platform. I remember having a debate with Richard Stallman again at a conference in Germany in 1999, where I was saying, look, if you had all Google's source code, it would not matter. You could not still do Google unless you also had the business processes, the people, the servers. There's something different about this new class of software, and you have to get your head around it. And he said, oh, it doesn't matter, And of course it mattered a great deal. But I was thinking about, what does it mean for the internet to become a platform? So back in 2002, we ran a conference called Building the Internet Operating System, which was around that idea that the internet is becoming an OS. And of course, now that you kind of hold a smartphone and it's calling all these internet data services, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that the internet is becoming the OS. But there was another piece which goes back to this open source paradigm shift idea, which was that the IBM PC commoditized hardware, and everybody, and this is what I watched happening in my own career, everybody was familiar with the world in which hardware was the source of value. And in the early days of the PC revolution, people tried to differentiate themselves by, we have a faster bus, we have different, hardware features, because that was the world they were used to. Meanwhile, the company that really made out like bandit was Microsoft, because they realized that the new lock-in was software, which had been undervalued in the previous era. Now, Clay Christensen, the Harvard Business School professor who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma and many other books, about the time I was sort of crystallizing this idea, had this wonderful paper where he talked about the law of conservation of attractive profits. When something becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. So hardware became a commodity, the margins went out of hardware, software became really valuable. And I was thinking about, but wait, open source software and the open protocols of the internet are commoditizing software. So what's becoming valuable?
What is becoming?
And I came to the conclusion that it was large databases, often generated by user contribution over the net. And that was what I meant by Web 2.0.
What was consumer-generated content making some huge corpus that didn't exist before?
And so the way we told the Web 2.0 story originally was around this idea of why did some companies survive the dot-com bust? They got their value from user contribution. So if you look at eBay, even though it was a Web 1.0 success, it was one of the ones that survived because it collected value from its users. It had network effects in the data that was produced. Craigslist, network effects in the data. Google, less obvious, but
certainly they're indexing the web.
Yeah, they're indexing the web, and more than that, they were really smart about extracting meaning from what people did with the data. What did they click on? What AdSense, literally, AdWords, literally being able to predict what people would click on. All this user contribution. Amazon, way more in the way of nurturing reviews, showing you the products that people were most interested in, not the one that some vendor wanted to shove down your throat. So the people who got user contribution loans, and of course, since then, people have started generating more and more data. And so, given the name, everybody always said to me, well, they thought Web 2.0 was a version number, which it wasn't. They said, well, what's Web 3? And I would always say, well, it's not a version number. But if there was a Web 3, it would come when the data was generated not by people typing on keyboards, but by sensors. And I wrote a paper several years ago called Web Squared, where I talked about that idea. But sure enough, if you look at what's happening today with your smartphones, sensor-driven applications are what is driving collective intelligence. And of course, that was, I guess, my bumper sticker for Web 2.0 was harnessing collective intelligence.
So would Web 3
That's a lot of what I try to do.
Yeah, it's brand building, and it's what Tim O'Reilly is good at. Basically defining a moment, defining a movement.
I think there's two things that actually, there's really only one thing that I'm good at, I think. And I could be wrong.
Well, let's hear
I think I'm reasonably good at pattern recognition.
See the trend a little bit early.
And like I have some big ideas about the future and where it's going, and I see sort of individual stories or people who kind of light up part of that future. So I, for whatever reason, like say I have that idea about sensors, and then bang, I see that one, I see that one, I see different stories, and it's a lot of what actually they talk about in scenario planning. You kind of build a model of the future, and then you look for news stories that actually tell you that the future that you imagine is actually coming true.
And that's why on the way over here, you ask that question and you listen to the answer.
Yeah.
What are you working on?
That's right, because you hear from people, and I think that there is a kind of a thing that I guess I would also say that I'm good at, and maybe it's not that I'm good at it so much as that it's the things that I'm bad at. I'm bad at caring about money. I'm good at caring about ideas and people with big ideas. I once, when my kids were little, I remember watching a Sesame Street episode in which the Cookie Monster won a game show, and behind door number 1 was $1 million, behind door number 2 was a chateau in France or a yacht or something, behind door number 3 was a cookie. And of course, you know what he chose, right?
So you're going to choose the idea every time?
Absolutely.
You choose interacting with the people?
Yeah, so somebody interviewed me this morning and they said, what's your favorite startup? And I said, it's probably Terry Jones's Fluid Info, because I'm not sure it's going to work.
I don't think he's sure. Well, he's sure it's going to work, but nobody can understand it unless they've met with him 5 times.
But it's like he's got his teeth into something that's like bigger than he is, and he's probably, he may be overwhelmed, but he may not get it. But like that's that passion. It's kind of like the Wright brothers who wanted to fly, or Thomas Edison with his light bulb or whatever. It's not the entrepreneur who's chasing the $1 million. It's the entrepreneur who's chasing the big idea. And kind of looking at my career, that's been so much of what I've seen. How much innovation happens when people are just having fun. And that's why, for example, when the whole Make revolution, Dale kind of picked up on that. It was like, there's a lot here, because people aren't doing it because they think they're going to get rich. They just think it's cool. And then I look at all the other things. Back when we started with the web, we wrote about the World Wide Web in 1992. There were only 200 websites when we published about it in the Whole Internet Users Guide, and not that many more when we started GNN, which was the first web portal early in 1993. It was because we just saw people were like, oh, this is freaking amazing. And I came up with the advertising business model. I guess that's kind of my curse, because I basically said, I was literally I was getting these trade newspapers, and this is in the days when the internet had this no commercial use.
Yeah, no banner ads. Yeah.
Well, the banner ad hadn't even been invented yet. It was literally no commercial use. And when we launched GNN, I actually got a sort of informal dispensation from Steve Wolf at the National Science Foundation, which had oversight of the internet. He said, well, our charter is in support of research and education, and if you guys aren't in support of that, I don't know who is, so go for it. The case that I made was that, the web was different from previous email, internet phenomena like email, and that you could, you were just putting the ads on your site. But our first advertising on GNN, we actually had to build sites for people. The ads were actually hosted on the site because, hey, nobody was doing it. We had to do a study. We did the first study of the internet as a possible advertising medium in 1994. We were trying to build that future. But I was really sparked by the idea of all these trade magazines that I used to get. And they used to have little bingo cards. Again, if you're old, you'll remember that. You'd see an advertisement and say bingo number 99, and circle 99 and mail in this card.
Get more information.
Yeah. And I was sort of thinking, that's a business model for the internet. And we'll actually be able to build sites that will replace those brochures that get mailed out in response to bingo cards. So the URL will become the pointer, and you'll just go there. And that was really the first version of internet advertising or web advertising.
You sold GNN.
Yeah, we sold to AOL, so we have something in common.
Right, exactly.
And the reason I sold it is kind of an interesting one.
I mean, and to be clear, GNN was Yahoo before Yahoo existed. You had made a directory of the web long before Yahoo existed, and AOL was charging $4.95 an hour for internet access. Not even for internet access, just for their own walled garden. And you sold it to them. Do you regret that?
No, what I really regret is that I sold the AOL stock too soon. Because once we sold it, we realized that AOL didn't have a clue, and so we dumped our AOL stock as soon as we could. And if we'd hung on to the peak, it would have been $1 billion. As it was still a nice
so
sale for us.
We should follow what you do early, but not what you do late.
Actually, it's interesting because in the mid '90s, Cisco tried to acquire O'Reilly. And I said, why would Cisco want to acquire a book publisher? And this guy said, well, you guys have been there first more times than anyone else, but you failed to exploit it.
It's an interesting,
and I said, well, you can just follow what we do and go exploit it if you want. But the reason why I sold GNN was I think important. I had been around a lot of startups in my early career as a consultant. It was really in the mini computer era, not the, but what I saw was that these companies that had started out with this incredible promise and idealism tended to become just sort of boring and like other companies. And I didn't want to do that. My original business plan was interesting work for interesting people. And I just wanted to have a lifestyle company where I could do things that mattered to me. And so I didn't really want to lose control. And I suppose you could say, well, I regret, I could have been much wealthier or whatever. But I've had a lot of fun and made a lot of difference by doing it the way I did it. But I read a book, I think it was called Marketing High Technology by Ron Davidow. And he had an appendix in there where he just did the math. And he said the only way you can dominate a market is by being more than half the market and growing faster than the market. And I went, oh, well, the web is growing so fast that as a private company, I'm not going to be able to do that. The only way I could do that is if we took in a lot of money, and I don't want to take in money, so we've got to sell it.
You never took money for O'Reilly, but O'Reilly over 3 decades, probably worth $100 million.
Oh, at least.
So you have no regrets. I mean, you've built a lifestyle business that still has tremendous value.
Absolutely. I mean, I have some regrets in that, I've created a fair number of billionaires and millionaires. I mean, I've had probably at least a half dozen billionaires come and say, "Oh yeah, it started with some book I bought from you." And there's people who've worked for me and who've left and become quite wealthy. Ev was probably
Evan Williams, Twitter.
Ev worked for O'Reilly, his first job out of when he came from Iowa. But that's great. He went on. But I've sometimes felt that the people who stuck with O'Reilly because they bought into my values, have been around all this stuff and haven't had that
ridiculous win.
Yeah, ridiculous win. But so I've had some regrets about that. But by my my sort of stubborn insistence on remaining private through several booms. I haven't done as well for the people who work for me as I might have if I had been wanting to cash in myself. But that's a choice they could have made, and I've kind of reconciled myself with that over the years. And some of them have left, and some of them have stuck.
I'm told we've gone 30 minutes already. It feels like we've gone 3 minutes. There's a microphone somewhere over there, so if you guys want to queue up and ask a question, we'll take questions from the audience with one caveat. If somebody starts promoting their product and or service in their question, I'd like you to all boo and hiss until they stop. Okay, so we have that going. So feel free to line up. Let's take a total segue, a total right turn, and talk about politics, because you have pattern recognition, and somewhere a year or two ago, I saw you start writing about politics and open government a lot.
Yeah.
It's always puzzled me when somebody so intelligent gets into politics, because it's so many stupid people who work so slowly are not so innovative. Why do you want to work with all these people who are not innovative?
First of all, let me make a distinction between politics and government.
Yes.
Because I'm not terribly interested in politics. I am interested in government and how we can make it better. And I got into it in a lot of ways the same way I get into anything, as I see interesting people And so I've been following kind of government hacking for years. Carl Malamud, who is really one of the unsung heroes of the internet, guy been around forever, now has a nonprofit startup called law.gov, where he's trying to put all the legal materials of the United States online, including, building codes and the technical standards that are incorporated by reference. Because he basically says, oh my God, we are governed by laws that we cannot read unless we actually pay some service to read them, or have to go down to the courthouse where they're recorded. This is ridiculous, But he, in 1993, created the first government website. He put the SEC Edgar database online, which later led to things like Yahoo, Finance, and so on. But he did it because, at the time, you paid $50,000 and you got the tapes or whatever, or you got the feed. If you were a big financial analyst, and he thought ordinary consumers ought to have access to this data. So he had support from people in Congress and so on, but it was one of these things, it'll take us years and it'll cost tens of millions of dollars. He got some hackers together, he did it in about 6 weeks. He actually got a grant from the National Science Foundation and servers donated by Eric Schmidt, who was then his son. He put this thing up online and operated for a year and a half, and then donated it to the federal government. And it's fabulous. Go to his website, his old historical website, media.org, and you'll see all these amazing documents. But he's been basically pushing open government for years. And then we saw it kind of bubbling up again. I got interested in the political side a little bit around the Howard Dean campaign, they were using the internet, and I actually ran at ETAC in 2004, sort of some open government kinds of things. But then it was like 2005, the second mashup ever done on Google Maps, chicagocrime.org, putting government data on the map. Tom Steinberg of My Society, his work in the UK with the site like They Work For You or FixMyStreet.com.
Yeah.
So hackers were kind of just nibbling away at this stuff, and I just watched that bubbling up. And so I started getting more and more interested, and then I just had this sort of crazy idea to take a Web 2.0 style conference to Washington. And then I was like, well, I'm not sure where I should go with this. And Eric Schmidt gave me some pretty good advice, which is, he said, Tim, you're really good at storytelling, so go talk to a lot of people and then tell us what you hear. And kind of my breakthrough came in a conversation with a guy named Frank DiGiamarino, who was at the time at the National Academy of Public Administration, now works for recovery.gov. And he mentioned this concept of vending machine government, which had come out of a book by a Napa fellow. And I didn't even know what it meant. I later read the book, and it turned out the guy had a very different meaning for it than I took from it. But the image, for me, was very powerful. We think of our government as a vending machine into which we put in taxes and get out services. And it's a really flawed model. And a much better model is to think about government as a platform. And I thought, this is way too geeky. It will never fly in Washington. And yet, I started telling it to people, and they got it. And they got it partly because the iPhone had made this fabulous teachable moment. Because, of course, the way government programs work is a lot like the way phones used to work. You get together with some little cabal of companies, and you produce, okay, here is your solution, take it or leave it. And all of a sudden, this sort of very stable, staid market exploded. Partly because there were some genuine innovations in the design of the iPhone, but then because it became a
platform for
development. A platform. And so I said, what if government worked more like that? And instead of trying to deliver goods and services from the vending machine. And by the way, the real part of the vending machine model was that I thought that this idea that Gov 2.0, so to speak, was about increasing citizen participation was wrong if all the participation meant was better ways to shape the vending machine. We didn't get the candy bar we wanted, or it cost too much, or whatever. No, we have to really transform it. And so I said, okay, what are some good examples? So I'll give you one. The traditional one people will trot out is, the internet was a government program. But that was sort of like a research project. That wasn't. Here's a really good one. Ronald Reagan is the father of Foursquare. Clearly, think about that. Okay, well, it turns out, when the Navy and the Air Force put up the GPS system, they did not have to make the decision to open it up for civilian use. In fact, there's a lot of debate about it. It was Reagan who, after a U.S. airliner was shot down in over North Korea because Australia and North Korean airspace said, hey, when you guys finish this GPS thingy, let's open it for civilian use. It was an executive order that he, of course, it didn't actually happen, didn't finish till under Clinton's administration, so you can say that Clinton was the father of Foursquare too. But, the fact is, fabulous. Government built some difficult, hard-to-use infrastructure, and then it opened it to the market. And all these things that the market has delivered since, from Google Maps navigation, to say, well, Foursquare and Koala are the product of that one policy decision. And it seemed to me that if we could get government more thinking like that, like what are the hard things? Eisenhower, with the interstate highway initiative.
So maybe broadband.
Broadband certainly could be in that category. The open data initiatives. I think there's some amazing things happening right now in healthcare.
Education.
There could be some in education. I'm not sure what they are. Let me talk a little bit about healthcare. There's several aspects. We're being bankrupted by our healthcare system. And, what if Medicare, for starters, worked a little bit more like Google, where there were feedback loops about what actually works and doesn't. We reimbursed based on outcomes rather than on, the old spray to pray. As Wanamaker famously said about advertising, half of my advertising doesn't work. The only problem is I don't know which half. And Google changed them. And so I think we have that ability to do that in healthcare, and the folks at Medicare are working on it. Meanwhile, they're being the people. This is where I do get political. They're being savaged by the people who should be embracing that kind of market response because, of course, they're on the wrong side of the political divide. And I think that's why I actually tend to think that one of the things that's really broken about government is politics. There's a sane middle in both parties attached to an insane fringe in both parties. And unfortunately, they split the smart part down the middle as well as the crazy part. If we could have just the smart part of both parties, we'd have a real working functioning government.
Just chop off the fringe like that. I can't see it out to the audience, but I'm going to assume somebody has a question, so can I get a concise question from the audience, please?
I can't see it all either.
Or is there nobody online? What are your politics? Are you Republican? Are you Democrat? Are you Libertarian? What are you?
I'm a Taoist. No, I think of myself as an independent. I want to see people who have ideas and who have passion. I think I've been a big supporter of the Obama administration, but there's a lot of crazy things that where I find myself more in tune with the Republicans. I guess I would tend to say my values lean Republican on the fiscal side and Democrat on the social side. But I have to say that the Democrats tend to actually do a better job of expressing Republican fiscal values.
The Republicans aren't getting very liberal.
Anyway, it's kind of sort of. I'm not sure that there's anybody that I feel really good about. I feel very good about individuals in American politics, but the system is absolutely broken.
I was going to ask you what your take on our energy policy is and the Middle East and our dependence on foreign oil. If you were president, well, one, I think everybody in the room would be pretty happy, yes? I think Tim O'Reilly for president is pretty good at it. If you were running and had all these intelligent people, that's in your... If all of a sudden we magically made you president and all your intelligent people in your circles from food camp or whatever, and food camp becomes, your cabinet. Well, it's kind of interesting. You're playing a lot of werewolf in the White House. It's an inside joke, but what would you do with our energy policy, with the Middle East, with the wars, everything? What would be your solution?
Well, first of all, let me say this, that I have a lot of sympathy for how hard it is to move large organizations. And you asked me over lunch, what would I do if I were running Microsoft? And I said, I think I'd do what Bill Gates did. I'd quit and go work on other more interesting problems.
You don't like the large companies. You're purposely kept small.
And because fixing a large broken thing is a very special skill set, and it's hard. And I'm not sure I would be good at it. But that being said, I think I wish that I would see more values-driven decisions out of today's White House. I think, I didn't agree with Reagan's politics, but I loved that he had a core of values. Jimmy Carter, core of values that drove their decisions. And I thought Obama had more of that than he does. And I've been disappointed to see him being pragmatic, because pragmatic usually means making expedient decisions. And the thing that I love about great tech companies too are that they have values. It's like the reason why I consider Google a great company and Facebook a great company is because when you talk to Larry and Sergey, or when you talk to Mark, you know that there's somebody who's deeply wrestling with hard problems that they really care about, and that they're not just trying to optimize that thing to make money. And that's wonderful. And so, so back to some specific answers. I think, energy policy has been fatally broken in this country since Jimmy Carter. I mean, if we had followed the path that Carter set after the '73 oil embargo, this would be a very, very different world. We'd be facing a different world with respect to climate change, to sort of our dependence on foreign oil. We probably would never have gotten into a bunch of the wars that we've gotten into, and I really do think that there are some civilization-changing things in our future. One of the more sobering things that I read in recent years was an article in Technology Review by a guy named Keith Bostrom, in which he talked about Fermis Paradox. How many people out here know about Fermis Paradox? Right? Well, this is this concept from the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And there's this thing called Drake's equation, where astronomer Frank Drake basically took all these factors, said, okay, how likely is it that, how many stars are there, how likely is it that they have planets, how many of those planets are in the habitable zone, how long does it take for life to develop, and he kind of developed this complex equation, and by coming up with your guesses for the value of each of the factors in that equation, you say, well, how many intelligent civilizations should there be? And even with very conservative values for all those things, he came up with that there should be, thousands of intelligent civilizations at any particular time. And Fermi's paradox was, yes, Frank, but where are they? And so anyway, Bostrom's article was a reflection on Fermi's paradox. And he said, I hope that we don't find life out there. Because if we don't find life, we know that life is extremely scarce. And that's why we're not finding anybody. If life is common, then we know that the great winnowing is still ahead of us. And I thought that was a really scary, thought-provoking thought. But then I had this crazy thought, because I was at that point reading a lot about peak oil as well as climate change. And I thought, what if the great winnowing, and when I was growing up it was, oh, we're going to blow ourselves up with nuclear bombs. But what if the great winnowing is, we use all the cheap energy, we fail to, solve for alternative, energy, our technological civilization collapses, and future civilizations just can't get back past the Victorian age, because, hey, cheap energy isn't there to be found. There's just not enough of it. We used it all. And I thought that was so, I wrote a post about that. But I think about things like, energy policy is really critical. We need a hell of a lot more engineers driving U.S. policy and a lot fewer lawyers. I mean, that's another thing. I guess going back to, if we could change one thing, it'd be great to throw out all the laws, have sunset provisions built into every law that's ever passed, so it has to be reinvented. I think we really need to actually have small bills. This idea of somebody presenting an omnibus bill that's 2,300 pages, forget it.
These are platform changes.
That's right. These are platform changes. It's like simplify what we're doing. I mean, the National Highway Bill, I believe, was 26 pages. Right? The healthcare bill, 2,300 pages. Having a short bill that kind of expresses intent and let people go innovate against that, way more important than
Question from the audience.